Hello and welcome to this edition of Joy in Our Town. I'm Ferrell, Tata, your host, and I'm honored today to have Nigel Mumford. He is going to be talking about PTSD. Our issue today is family. And Father Nigel is an ordained Episcopal priest. He's a former Marine with Her Majesty's Royal Commandos. He's a former drill instructor. He's an author and international speaker. His most recent book is After the Trauma, the Battle Begins. And he's the founder of By His Wounds Ministry. Welcome, Nigel.
Thank you
for being with us today.
It's a privilege. Thank you so much.
Now, I know that you have a passion for helping combat veterans because of your own experience in being in combat with the Royal Marines. Can you talk a little bit about your experience?
Yes, absolutely. In the early 70s, I was in combat for a year of my life over 3 tours of duty. I was shot at 3 times, I was blown up 5 times, I was injured in the head. But that wasn't really the primary cause of the trauma. It was as a drill instructor taking recruits through basic training. My biggest fear was that somebody would die that I'd trained. And there was a bomb, there was an IED, improvised explosive device that went off and killed 4 of my recruits. And when I heard that information, I couldn't function, I couldn't speak, and for a week or so I couldn't actually make any noise at all. I was so traumatized. And then for 6 months I stuttered very badly. The biggest fear that I had was that would happen, and it broke my heart. It broke me completely. And I was hospitalized and had all the classic symptoms of shell shock. But the good news really is that we can come to a new place, an understanding of that within our hearts. We get trapped in the battle, and there are ways, creative ways, that we can get out of that entrapment and that fight-flight issues that we have, that caveman instinct. I wrote, if I may just say, that in my book, After the Trauma, the Battle Begins, I wrote, "The mind is witness to a catastrophic event. The intellect cannot cope with what it has seen. The body reacts physically under duress. The heart receives emotional scar tissue. The soul weeps. This mental trauma is a total body reaction to horror. And having witnessed horror firsthand, having witnessed man's inhumanity to man, having witnessed the gravity of death in combat, has changed my life completely. And because of that, I've turned it round. And as my mum in her wisdom said, you've been recycled. And I feel like I've been recycled, and I want to pay back what I've learned to help the combat veteran and the wife or the spouse of the suffering relationship, which destroys marriages, destroys families, and indeed just destroys life in suicide.
Absolutely. Now, you kind of coined the phrase shell shock, but also PTSD. There are so many names for it. Can you talk about the different names and why that is? Absolutely,
there are a lot of names, and of course it goes back to the caveman, actually. Of course there's nothing written down or written in stone from the caveman, but people being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, they realized that had problems. In 600 BC, the ancient Greeks were coming back from war, and their wives, girlfriends and mothers discovered that the men were behaving strangely. Ancient Greek civilization before Christ. And the names fascinate me because we're so locked into PTS, post-traumatic stress. It's been called a soldier's heart. In the War of Independence, it was called nostalgia. Homesickness is another one. I can't explain the Spanish words, but it was the Spanish description is to be broken. And in combat you are broken. Railway spine in England, it's fascinating that people in trains, when the railway was invented, had a crash. They hurt their necks, but they also realized they hurt their mind in the trauma that they experienced. A soldier's heart, irritable heart syndrome, battle shock, shell shock, operational stress reaction, moral injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, and now, quite frankly, they've dropped the disorder, it's post-traumatic stress.
Well, it's amazing to me that after, for years and years, basically as, old as time, and yet there is still so much shame and hiding behind that. Why do you think that is?
Very much so. It's the shame of not being able to complete the task. It's the shame of being in battle and then coming home and trying to assimilate back to normal when you haven't been normal. PTSD, in my opinion, is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. I'm going to say that again because it's very important.
Yes.
It's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. The issue in the military today, quite frankly, is the fact that if you mention it, you could ruin your career.
Right.
So how do you, within the military, say, I've got a problem. I'm having these reactions. I'm having reactions to the trauma that happened 6 months ago, 5 years ago, indeed in a Vietnam vet or World War II vet, 30, 40, 50, 70 years ago. How do we live a normal life after receiving and witnessing a horror? And incidentally, this is not just only the military. It happens to anybody. Rape victims, car crash, witnessing the horrors of life, man's inhumanity to man, witnessing a robbery, witnessing death, somebody else's death, or the perhaps imminent death of yourself. That can create post-traumatic stress. And it's a major issue. It's a major problem in this country. And sadly, it's growing.
Right.
One of the things I've learned by meeting two people of Jewish faith, actually, my age, both of them have parents who are in the concentration camps. That both of them couldn't work, one man, one woman, because their parents were in camps. They've learnt it from their parents. They learnt PTSD. They learnt about survivor's guilt from their parents in Auschwitz and Birkenwald. And now they can't function. And I'm really concerned for the nation down the road of how our children are going to react, because we're learning from daddy or mummy who's been in combat, and we're learning from them from the issues that they've gone through. And of course we learn from our parents. We're like little computers, really. And we're downloading stuff from our parents. Well, daddy did this, well, mummy did that. And we learn how to do it. And I'm very heartbroken for the future and the possibility of what might happen with our children, and we need to find a way to help.
Now, what would you say to a spouse who may be watching and they know that their husband or wife is experiencing some of, or they suspect that it's PTS? What would you say to them? What should they do? Fantastic
question, Anne. Really good question. It's very important to know that the spouse is not the enemy. Very important. Often the combat veteran will see their spouse as the enemy, as a threat. Often they will wake up at night and hit them, or try and strangle them, or something chronic. They'll react with sudden, never, for instance, wake up a veteran, because they will react with an exaggerated startle response. The best thing to do is to sit down with the spouse and say, teach me, how do I express myself? How do we process this? How do we get through this? Teach me as a spouse what works for you. When a veteran is triggered, he will go into fight-flight mode. That means he'll run away or he'll fight his way out. Physically, the body gets 400% more blood in the muscles. So we want to fight, we want to flight, we want to run away in true Monty Python affect. Run away, run away. But, we need to understand with the spouse that when the spouse is triggered, we need to know how to understand. So, will you hold me, or do you need some space? And to have even an unspoken little signal to do something like this means leave me alone, or this means let's talk, hug me, or just come and hug me without speaking. It's very important for the veteran to know the spouse is not the enemy.
Right. Well, you mentioned briefly about moral injury. Can you explain what does that mean, moral injury?
Yes, moral injury is kind of a new nomenclature for this issue. That's not quite PTSD. But moral injury really means, from the background of the person, how they were brought up. Perhaps they have a particular faith. Perhaps they were brought up with strict morals. Perhaps they don't have any morals at all. But a moral injury really is going against the grain of what one has been brought up with. So, for instance, if you have to shoot somebody, the issue, not killing somebody is a big issue. How do we deal with that? How do we cope with that? So moral injury is a new term in this issue of post-traumatic stress, but it's sort of one down, if you will, from the diagnosis of PTS, or the issue of how the person deals with, in mind, body, how do they deal with what they've had to do.
So I know there are a lot, again, this is something that you're hearing more and more about, because there have been a lot of situations where they've acted out and harmed other people and themselves. What are some of options for people that are experiencing this? What can they do?
Yes. Well, there's a lot they can do, and a lot we would recommend, and kind of going in chronological order, as it were. The first thing to do would be to get therapy, to get some help. And that's not a sign of weakness, that's a sign of strength and courage. The next thing would be medication. Medication, again, is not the enemy. When we allow the enemy to win, the enemy's winning, and we can't allow that to happen.
Right.
So medication is on our side. Family therapy, to learn skills, how to communicate, particularly when the spouse is triggered, when the spouse is not in a good place. How do we deal with that situation? Rather than getting angry, let's sit down and talk about it. So we need to teach the family coping skills. How do we cope with this? We need to teach practical approaches in how to deal with the situation. There's a thing called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral treatment, which is a bit of a mouthful, and we don't have time to talk about that right now, but another area is EMDR, which is eye movement or desensitization, or tapping, to train the person to move from one frame of reference to a different frame of reference, to reframe the memory, as it were, of reframing a memory. And probably one of the latest things is HBOT, which is hyperbaric oxygen treatment, which I'm just learning about and might be giving it a shot myself, which is fascinating, where a person would be put into a decompression chamber and brought down to a certain level of compression, a bit like being in an airplane, and breathing 100% oxygen. And that's helping terrifically in the area of post-traumatic stress, and also TBI, traumatic brain injury. And it's physically helping, and they can actually map that.
It's amazing.
It really is amazing. They can actually map it in the brain from CAT scans and various ways. TBI is a big issue, combined with PTSD is a major issue. And then we also have brain scans, neurofeedback, and advanced brain imaging. So there's a lot a patient or a veteran can do.
Now, you, going back to your own experience, you know, you're a drill sergeant, you're a Marine. I mean, those are the manliest of men. How were you able to, you know, put your pride or your, I'm a man, you know, can you talk about, I mean, you're right, there's no shame in any of this. We all need to help each other. Can you talk a little bit about how you were able to just say, I need help?
Well, at the start, I was not able to say, because I could barely speak, and I didn't know what was wrong. In the early 70s, well, mid-70s, mid to late 1978, I realized that I couldn't function. I knew there was something wrong with me, but I didn't know what it was. I was not aware of any of this as a Marine. It's not something we were taught, and it was a huge sense of shame. My friends didn't come to see me in hospital. It was awful. It was really, really bad, and of course I was invited to leave the Marines. Which is terrible. My career, I wanted to be an officer. I was, you know, on the way to being an officer. I enjoyed being a drill instructor. I say now that as a drill instructor, I used to make grown men cry. And now as a minister, I still make grown men cry. You know, it's funny how that works. We're being recycled. But how do we deal with that? Well, we have to deal with it. It is shame-based. And I'm sad that it is shame-based. But we've got to, as a man, perhaps, I don't want to use the word man up, but we've got to stand up and say, right, I've got a problem and I need help. And that's why people are turning to alternative therapy, i.e. alcohol, i.e. all the other issues of addictions, and sadly to suicide. And that is a major issue, 22 a day killing themselves. And that's, you know, really, really serious. And that's where my heart breaks, because there is hope. There is hope. There's no need to kill yourself. You know, that's not an option in my opinion. Get some help, you know. And to be able to say, you know, I've got an issue, this reoccurring nightmare, this dream, this reaction, this car backfiring, this child screaming, this loud music, this TV show is hurting me, and I need help. And to be able to do that is to be very strong in nature.
Absolutely. Like you said, that's brave.
Yes.
So we are going to take a break, and after the break we're going to continue our discussion on PTS, and we're also going to switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about depression among the military. I'm Ferrell, your host of Joy in Our Town, and we've been talking to Nigel Mumford, and we will be right back. Welcome back to Joy in Our Town. I'm Ferrell, your host, and I've been talking today with Nigel Mumford, an ordained Episcopal priest and author of After the Trauma, the Battle Begins. And our issue today is family, and we're going to be talking this segment about dealing with depression. Welcome back.
Thank you.
Nigel. Thank you for being here. So can you talk a little bit about what is your definition of depression?
Yes. It's a big hole, a very big hole, and it can be habitual, it can be noticeable, it can be not noticeable. You can be going along the track of life, and then suddenly you find yourself going down that hole. and it's deeper and deeper, darker and darker, and all-encompassing. It's not a nice place. As a drill instructor in the Marines, I didn't know that I was depressed. I didn't know that I was upset. As a man who was suffered terribly from the swine flu, I was asked by my doctor probably about 3 years ago, are you depressed? I said no. You know, the Marine in me was still there. I'm not depressed. And my wife looked at me and I looked at her, and I knew I'd lied. So I called him up the next day and I said, actually, I lied, I'm depressed. The problem I had at that point was climbing the stairs. I've lost a third of my lung because of the swine flu. Every time I used to run up the stairs. As a drill instructor, I'd make my men run up the stairs always. And I was lucky if I could climb the stairs or even get it halfway up. And I realized halfway up the stairs, I started to weep because I'd lost what I used to have. And so medication helps. And the fact that one is depressed, to fight that, one needs help.
Right.
Because it's not a nice place. And it's a precursor, obviously, to many sicknesses, the broken heart, and obviously moving into suicidal affect. It's a dangerous thing, but there is help.
No, can you differentiate, or can you differentiate between depression with the general public, military, and then even combat veterans?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's probably easier to be depressed as a civilian because you can get away with it. In the military, it becomes pretty obvious. We've got that bravado, we've got that manly, you know, man up, get on with the job. It's hard to hide it, but people hide it and then react in different ways. And in a veteran, it's very much, it's pretty obvious actually in veterans, because it's part of the issue. It ties in with PTSD, it ties in with moral injury. It's part of who we are. When we've had something abnormal in our lives, again, it's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. Is depression in the package? Yes. If something bad's going to happen, you might get depressed. Incidentally, it can be generational. You know, if your mother or your father suffers from depression, that might be an issue too. So again, it's something we need to address and need to get help, and it's not a sign of weakness. It really isn't. And I fought that. I mean, I'm a Marine, I'm a commando, I'm a Green Beret, blah, blah, blah. But to say I've got a problem has healed me, has set me free from those issues of putting on a brave face. I have to say, some years ago, a mentor of mine said to me, I was complaining about something I was about to do that I was frightened about. And he said, Nigel, I have 2 words for you. I said, what's that, Francis? He said, have fun. Have fun. This friend of mine, this mentor, gave me permission to have fun. And you know what? That changed my life. I'm British. That stiff upper lip was removed. And to know to have fun is a huge, huge thing, to give somebody permission. So if you're listening to this, have fun. Think about how you can have fun in life and to set you free from having fun. Give your soul, give yourself permission to have fun. You know?
Well, I think in your book you talk about humor is an essential part of the process of healing, of getting healing, whether it's PTS or depression or anything.
Very much so. You know, if you can't laugh, do something else. You know, if you're not having fun, do something else. That was a fulcrum moment in my life to say have fun. It changed my life completely. It gave me permission to joke. It gave me permission to say something funny. Sometimes I go over the area, of course, and have to bring it back in again. But that's life. You know, let's have some fun. It's very easy to be depressed. It's very easy to go into a place of habitual depression, and that's where it's very difficult to break a habit. Psychologists, psychiatrists say in 21 days you can break a habit. So I put it to you, if you're depressed, think about what you can do in the next 21 days to break that. So you're going along the journey, you realize you've gone down that path, you might have gone down a mile down that path, back it up and realize to the point, and each time it happens, back it up, back it up, back it up until you realize, oops, I'm going down that path, I don't need to go there. I'm not going to allow depression to take over my life and to ruin my life and indeed everybody else's life around me. It's a hard thing. And for the spouse who is with somebody who's depressed, that's not easy.
Right.
And again, that ties in with PTSD, depression, the whole painting, the whole issue, the whole concern. How do we deal with that? With help, we get help, and we learn to carry one another's burdens, as it were.
Well, so can you talk about, because some people that are watching they may not know exactly that's what it is, but what are some of the symptoms and what are the things that they can look for? I know you talked about the black hole,
Yes.
but how does it manifest in different people?
Absolutely. Staring off into space would be an obvious one. A general morose, body language, no eye contact, negative affect, speaking negatively, with no hope, the loss of hope, a loss of compassion, a loss of a will to live, a loss of a sense of humor. When the person starts to flatline, life changes for them and the people around them. So in one sense, it's obvious. In another, it can be subtle. But again, I would draw on the habitual. If it's a habit, then, be aware of that and get some help. If in doubt, shout. If in doubt, shout for some help. Yeah. Invite somebody in.
Excuse me, I was just going to say, I love how, you talk about like mind over matter in a way, like fighting those thoughts, but then you also talk about medication. So
Yes.
I guess for a lot of people, it's a combination, because there's no shame in being medicated.
That's right.
I mean, that's what they're for.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I'm glad you brought up mind over matter. As a drill instructor, I used to say that a lot. It's mind over matter. I don't mind, and you don't matter. But medications are there for a reason.
Right.
Technology is there for a reason. We have technology. I know I wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for technology. When I had the swine flu 5 years ago, if that had happened 10 years ago, I'd be dead. There's no doubt about that. So to allow the medications to do the job. Now, in depression, there are a lot of medications, and some meds don't work with some people. Some work very well with different people.
Right.
So, if you found your medication isn't working, find a new medication. And be proactive. Ask the right questions from your doctor, from your physician, from your psychiatrist. It's vitally important. And when you find the right one, brilliant. Live life. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And laugh.
And laugh, yes. You've got to have fun, Got to have fun.
So what is or can you talk about the relationship between depression and PTS? Like, did one come first? Is one the result of the other, or or is there no relationship?
It's very much, the chicken and the egg.
Yeah.
I think depression is part and parcel of any emotional concern or any emotional disorder. For instance, if you lose a loved one, which is death, which, particularly in combat, if you lose a loved one in death, are you going to be depressed? Of course. When you look at depression, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross talks about the denial, the anger, the bargaining, the depression, and finally the acceptance. So we move from one place to another, and we could be at acceptance at 11 o'clock and bargaining at 12 o'clock. It jumps from each one. So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Depression is a natural reaction to a loss. And that could be a loss of a job, loss of a spouse, loss of a child, loss of a mother's combat veteran's son, the loss of a combat veteran's mind, and the physical loss of a leg. People get depressed.
Right.
And it's part of the human nature, and we need help, and we need creative ways of finding help in those areas.
Well, I appreciate so much your transparency and your honesty about your own experience, but can you share a little bit, because I think this will really help people that are watching that may have somebody in their life, whether it's a sibling or a spouse or a child or a parent who's experiencing some of this, but you were really young when this happened to you and this horrible experience, but then you also had your healing, but then you had some residual things that you're still working through. Then you meet your lovely wife. How did you talk to her about this, and how did you sort of put into practice some of the boundaries that you needed to cope with this ongoing?
I was very clear in setting those boundaries. I said to Lynn, don't wake me up if I'm asleep. Never come up behind me.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but in a restaurant I need to sit facing the entrance, always. There are certain, not rules, but certain suggestions, strong suggestions to my bride that this is how we need to live. It's sad, and I think I'm 99% healed, but there's always part of me who is going to react. And to teach the spouse and to communicate with the spouse, this is what I need, is so important. And I think that's where we go wrong, because the victim, if you were, of PTSD is going to have that bravado and say, leave me alone, I can handle this. But it's teamwork. And when we get married, it's in sickness and in health. And we need to learn, we need to be creative in how we communicate. And PTSD is a huge problem. not only in suicide, but wrecking marriages, wrecking relationships. And again, it's not the enemy. And we need to find ways, creative ways to communicate with the spouse. Again, perhaps non-verbal, perhaps no is a complete sentence, you know, and to say, I need a hug without speaking. It's very powerful, but it's so important to have that conversation when the survivor is in a good place to be able to say, I need help right now.
Now, what would you say to somebody, let's say that they suspect their husband has been experiencing PTS, but he's already heavily drinking, and you know, it's sort of out of control, and his wife is feeling out of control. What would you say to her? Which steps should she take to try to get their family whole again? Well,
communication, of course, is the first step. I've noticed you behaving this way. How can I help you? I'm very worried about your health. I'm very worried about what's going on. We know about trauma, we know about shell shock, we know about post-traumatic stress. Can we go together to a therapist? Perhaps to suggest reading a book. I have a friend of mine who left my book on the cereal bowl, on the pillowcase, on his computer, and wouldn't pick it up until one day she left it in the bathroom in a certain place, and he had to pick it up off the seat, if you know what I mean. And he started reading it in that room, if you know what I mean. And then he got the message. Really saying, I care, I want to help you, you're not behaving the way you used to, how can I help you?
Yeah. We're about out of time, but very briefly, can you talk about your program, Welcome Home Initiative?
Yes,
in the last seconds.
Yes, 8 years ago we came up with the idea of helping combat veterans. So we designed a program called the Welcome Home Initiative. It's a 5-week or a 3-day program for combat veterans of all wars and all theaters of war. We've done 17 of them in upstate New York, and we've done 5 in Dayton, Ohio, and the response has been extraordinary. So, you know, I would highly recommend, we're going to be doing one locally in November. I would highly recommend you look into the Welcome Home Initiative, check out the webpage, and see what we have to offer. There is hope. There is hope. We don't need to suffer. I've been there, done that, seen the movie, got the bumper sticker, got the T-shirt, and know that you know, we can be healed and set free from this.
Thank you so much. This is really important, and I appreciate your transparency. We've been talking to Nigel Mumford. I'm Ferrell. Tata. This is Joy in Our Town. Thank you for joining us.
This program has been sponsored by the Trinity Broadcasting Network and made possible by your telethon dollars. Your continual support can keep Joy in Our Town brought to your home every day. So write Joy in Our Town, P.O. Box A, Santa Ana, California, 92711.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Joy in Our Town. I'm Ferrell, Tata, your host, and I'm honored today to have Nigel Mumford. He is going to be talking about PTSD. Our issue today is family. And Father Nigel is an ordained Episcopal priest. He's a former Marine with Her Majesty's Royal Commandos. He's a former drill instructor. He's an author and international speaker. His most recent book is After the Trauma, the Battle Begins. And he's the founder of By His Wounds Ministry. Welcome, Nigel.
Thank you
for being with us today.
It's a privilege. Thank you so much.
Now, I know that you have a passion for helping combat veterans because of your own experience in being in combat with the Royal Marines. Can you talk a little bit about your experience?
Yes, absolutely. In the early 70s, I was in combat for a year of my life, over 3 tours of duty. I was shot at 3 times, I was blown up 5 times, I was injured in the head. But that wasn't really the primary cause of the trauma. It was as a drill instructor taking recruits through basic training. My biggest fear was that somebody would die that I'd trained. And there was a bomb, there was an IED, improvised explosive device that went off and killed 4 of my recruits. When I heard that information, I couldn't function. I couldn't speak, and for a week or so, I couldn't actually make any noise at all. I was so traumatized. And then for 6 months, I stuttered very badly. The biggest fear that I had was that would happen, and it broke my heart. It broke me completely. And I was hospitalized and had all the classic symptoms of shell shock. But the good news really is that we can come to a new place, an understanding of that within our hearts. We get trapped in the battle, and there are ways, creative ways, that we can get out of that entrapment and that fight-flight issues that we have, that caveman instinct. I wrote, if I may just say, that in my book, After the Trauma, the Battle Begins, I wrote, "The mind is witness to a catastrophic event. The intellect cannot cope with what it has seen. The body reacts physically under duress. The heart receives emotional scar tissue. The soul weeps. This mental trauma is a total body reaction to horror. And having witnessed horror firsthand, having witnessed man's inhumanity to man, having witnessed the gravity of death in combat, has changed my life completely. And because of that, I've turned it round. And as my mum in her wisdom said, you've been recycled. And I feel like I've been recycled, and I want to pay back what I've learned to help the combat veteran and the wife or the spouse of the suffering relationship, which destroys marriages, destroys families, and indeed just destroys life in suicide.
Absolutely. Now, you kind of coined the phrase shell shock, but also PTSD. There are so many names for it. Can you talk about, you know, the different names and why that is?
Absolutely. There are a lot of names, and of course it goes back to the caveman, actually. Of course, there's nothing written down or written in stone from the caveman, but you know, people being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger, they realized they'd had problems. In 600 BC, the ancient Greeks were coming back from war, and their wives, girlfriends and mothers discovered that the men were behaving strangely. Ancient Greek civilization before Christ. And the names fascinate me because we're so locked into PTS, post-traumatic stress. It's been called a soldier's heart. In the War of Independence, it was called nostalgia. Homesickness is another one. I can't explain the Spanish words, but it was the Spanish description is to be broken. And in combat you are broken. Railway spine in England, it's fascinating that people in trains, when the railway was invented, had a crash. They hurt their necks, but they also realized they hurt their mind in the trauma that they experienced. A soldier's heart, irritable heart syndrome, battle shock, shell shock, operational stress reaction, moral injury, post-traumatic stress disorder, and now, quite frankly, they've dropped the disorder, it's post-traumatic stress.
Well, it's amazing to me that after, you know, for years and years, basically as, you know, old as time, and yet there is still so much shame and hiding behind that. Why do you think that is?
Very much so. It's the shame of not being able to complete the task. It's the shame of being in battle and then coming home and trying to assimilate back to normal when you haven't been normal. PTSD, in my opinion, is a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. I'm going to say that again because it's very important.
Yes.
It's a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. The issue in the military today, quite frankly, is the fact that if you mention it, you could ruin your career.
Right.
So how do you, within the military, say, I've got a problem. I'm having these reactions. I'm having reactions to the trauma that happened 6 months ago, 5 years ago, indeed, in a Vietnam vet or World War II vet, you know, 30, 40,